Have you ever done something good for someone only for everything to end in the worst possible way? This is the story of Jamal, a young man with a heart of gold who decided to help an elderly woman with her TV, but the next day, the police were knocking on his door. What really happened? Stay until the end because this story is not what it seems, and at the end, we will explain why it is so important. Jamal had always been a boy with a heart of gold. So when he saw Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman, struggling to get her TV to work, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. He knew he was supposed to head home immediately after school to take care of his siblings, but he simply couldn't ignore the old lady's plea. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said. Little did Jamal know that this simple act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jamal had always been a boy with a heart of gold. So when he saw Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman, struggling with her TV in the front yard, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. He knew he was supposed to head straight home after school to take care of his younger siblings, but he simply couldn't ignore the old lady's plea. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said. Mrs. Clark, with her silver hair framing a kind face, sighed with relief and invited him inside. As Jamal worked on the TV, they fell into a comfortable conversation. Mrs. Clark spoke about her life, sharing snippets of her past with Jamal. She had been a school teacher for 30 years, living her passion by teaching elementary school children. Her talks were filled with anecdotes and funny stories from her years as an educator. She even mentioned names that Jamal knew well. He listened attentively, genuinely interested in her stories. Seeing the world through a teacher's eyes instead of experiencing it as a student was fascinating to him. "What did you mainly teach?" Jamal asked. "Mostly third grade," she replied with a nostalgic smile. "Those children were always so full of life and curiosity. I've seen many of them grow up and become successful in their own ways. It's one of the joys of living in this community for so long." Jamal could imagine how fulfilling it must have been to be such an important part of so many people's lives. He thought about his own teachers and how they had impacted his life. It was clear that Mrs. Clark had been more than just an educator. She had been a mentor and a guide for many. After fixing the TV, Mrs. Clark offered Jamal a glass of lemonade. They sat on the porch and enjoyed the pleasant afternoon. "You know, Jamal," she said thoughtfully, "young people like you give me hope for the future. Your kindness today has made a world of difference to me." Walking back home, Jamal felt a warmth in his heart. Helping Mrs. Clark had been a simple act, but it brought joy to both of them. Little did Jamal know that the events set in motion by this act of kindness would soon take an unexpected turn and change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Jamal arrived home to the sound of laughter and the familiar clatter of dishes in the kitchen. His younger siblings, Aisha and Malik, were playing on the living room floor, their giggles filling the house. His mother stood at the stove, preparing dinner after a long shift at the hospital. The aroma of her famous chicken stew wafted through the air. It was the most comforting scent Jamal knew. "Hi, Mom," he called out, dropping his backpack by the door and walking into the kitchen. He gave his mother a quick hug. "How was work?" Mrs. Washington's face was marked with fatigue, but it brightened when she saw her eldest son. "It was a long day, but I'm coping," she told him. Jamal's days were long too. After school, he often went straight to his part-time job at the grocery store. There, he stocked shelves and helped customers until the afternoon. On weekends, he mowed lawns and did odd jobs for neighbors to earn extra money. Despite the demands on his time, he never complained. He saw it as a way to support his family and ease his mother's burden. At night, after his siblings were in bed, Jamal would stay up late studying. He had dreams of going to college, perhaps even becoming an engineer. The idea of making his mother proud and providing a more comfortable life for Aisha and Malik motivated him to keep pushing forward, no matter how tired he felt. The next morning, the Washington household buzzed with the usual activity. Jamal was getting ready for school. He helped Aisha and Malik with their backpacks while Mrs. Washington prepared breakfast. The routine was abruptly interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching their street. Jamal glanced out the window, his heart skipping a beat when he saw two police cruisers pull up in front of their house. Jamal stepped outside immediately. Neighbors began to gather as the police officers exited their vehicles, and to Jamal's astonishment, Mrs. Clark stepped out of one of the cars. She looked around nervously. "Mrs. Clark?" Jamal called out. Mrs. Clark's face lit up when she saw him. She walked towards him, followed by the police officers. Across the fence, Jamal's neighbors whispered among themselves. Mrs. Washington emerged from the house, worry written all over her face. She hurried Aisha and Malik inside, then rushed to Jamal's side. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Clark?" Jamal asked. Mrs. Clark seemed anxious. She said something had happened and that she needed to speak to him and his family. Once she was seated in the living room, Mrs. Clark began to explain. After Jamal helped her with her TV the day before, she realized her wallet was missing. At first, she thought maybe she had just misplaced it, but she couldn't find it anywhere. So she had to ask, "Did you take it?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jamal felt his stomach drop. "No, Mrs. Clark, I didn't take your wallet, I promise." One of the officers tried to calm the situation. He asked Jamal to tell them exactly what happened when he helped Mrs. Clark. Jamal took a deep breath and recounted the previous day's events in detail. He described how he had fixed the TV, talked with Mrs. Clark, and then returned home. He insisted that he hadn't seen the wallet or taken it. Clark listened carefully and then said, "I don't want to believe it, Jamal. You seemed like such a nice boy, but I can't ignore the fact that my wallet disappeared right after you helped me." Jamal's heart ached. He had only wanted to help, and now he was being accused of something he didn't do. He looked Mrs. Clark square in the eyes and said again that he hadn't seen or taken the wallet. There simply had to be another explanation. The officers exchanged glances. "We'll need to conduct a search of the house just to be thorough," one of them said. Once Jamal's mother gave them permission, the search was thorough. The officers went through each room looking for any sign of the missing wallet. Jamal and his family watched anxiously. They knew nothing would be found, but they felt humiliated nonetheless. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finished their search and returned to the living room. "We didn't find anything," one of them said. "We'll continue our investigation and keep you informed." Word of the incident spread quickly through the tight-knit community. It wasn't long before everyone seemed to have an opinion on what had happened between Jamal and Mrs. Clark. The reactions were mixed. Some neighbors were quick to jump to conclusions, whispering among themselves and casting suspicious glances at Jamal. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 doors down, was one of the first to voice her doubts. "I always thought Jamal was a good kid," she said to her friend over the fence, "but you never really know, do you? It's quite a coincidence him helping Mrs. Clark and then her wallet going missing." Others, however, were more supportive and refused to believe that Jamal could be involved in anything dishonest. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired mechanic who had known Jamal since he was a little boy, shook his head when he heard the news. "That boy wouldn't hurt a fly," he insisted. "He's always been helpful and respectful. This has to be some sort of misunderstanding." Jamal's friends rallied around him. Marcus, his best friend, was particularly vocal. "There's no way Jamal did this," he told anyone who would listen. "He's the most honest person I know. This is just wrong." At school, Jamal's classmates were buzzing with gossip. Some believed Mrs. Clark's claim, while others staunchly defended Jamal. Mrs. Green, his history teacher, called him aside after class. "Jamal, I know this must be hard for you, but I believe in your integrity. Keep your head up, and the truth will come out." Despite the support from his friends and family, Jamal couldn't escape the feeling of being under a microscope. Every time he walked down the street, he felt the weight of judgment from those who doubted him. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly trust could be shaken. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered at the local community center for a meeting. The topic of discussion was the recent events surrounding Jamal and Mrs. Clark. As people voiced their opinions, the room grew tense. Mrs. Clark also attended the meeting. She looked frail and tired. She stood up to address the crowd. "I've lived in this community for a long time," she said. "I've always believed in the goodness of my neighbors. The situation with my wallet has been very upsetting, but I don't want to point fingers without cause. Jamal has always been a respectful young man." Her words brought a momentary silence to the room. Some nodded in agreement while others remained skeptical. The meeting ended with a resolution to support both Mrs. Clark and Jamal as the police investigation continued. It was a small step towards healing the rift that the incident had caused in the community. Days passed, and the police continued their work. They interviewed neighbors and retraced Mrs. Clark's steps. The Washington family held on to the hope that the investigation would eventually clear Jamal's name. Until then, they supported each other. One afternoon, Jamal was helping his siblings with their homework in the living room. Malik, who was particularly tech-savvy at 8 years old, was playing on his tablet after finishing his assignments. He loved exploring the internet and was always curious about the latest trends and videos. "Hey, Jamal, check this out," Malik called out suddenly, his eyes wide with excitement. Jamal walked over to see what had caught his brother's attention. Malik was watching a video on a popular social media platform. The video showed a group of kids from the neighborhood. One of them, Kevin, was a notorious troublemaker. In the footage, he held up a wallet and bragged about how he had taken it from an old lady. "Check this out," Kevin boasted in the video. "I snagged this wallet from that old bat. She didn't even notice." Jamal's heart pounded as he watched the video. This was it, the proof they needed. To clear up the entire misunderstanding once and for all, he quickly grabbed Malik's tablet and rushed to show his mother. Mrs. Washington watched the video, gathered her keys, and told Jamal to come. They were going to the police. When they arrived, Officer Daniels was there to meet them. They showed him the video. "This changes everything," he said. "We'll need to investigate this further. But it seems we've found the real culprit." The police quickly shifted their focus to Kevin and his friends. They visited Kevin's house, and his parents were horrified to learn about the video. Kevin was brought in for questioning, and it wasn't long before he confessed to stealing Mrs. Clark's wallet. News spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The community was in disbelief that Kevin would stoop so low. Meanwhile, Jamal's name was finally and completely cleared. The weight of the suspicion that had hung over him for so long was finally lifted. Mrs. Clark visited the Washington household once more, this time alone. "Jamal, I can't thank you enough for what you and your family have done," she said. "I'm so sorry for everything you went through." The neighborhood came together to show their support for Jamal and his family. The ordeal had not only cleared Jamal's name, but also highlighted the importance of standing by one another in times of adversity. Mr. Rodriguez organized a small community gathering to celebrate the resolution of the incident. As the sun set on the gathering, Jamal looked around at the familiar faces and felt grateful. He was grateful for the lessons he had learned and the support he had received. The experience had changed him in a good way. It had deepened his empathy and strengthened his resolve to always stand up for what was right. In the weeks following the resolution of the wallet incident, life began to settle back into its normal rhythm for Jamal and his family. However, the impact of the ordeal lingered in the minds of everyone involved, especially Mrs. Clark, who felt a deep sense of guilt for having wrongly accused Jamal. A few days later, the Washington family received an invitation to a community meeting at the local school auditorium. They were curious and a bit anxious. The room was filled with familiar faces as everyone settled into their seats. Mrs. Clark took the stage. She held a microphone and smiled warmly at the crowd. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I have a very special announcement to make tonight." She glanced at Jamal. "Many of you know about the recent misunderstanding involving Jamal Washington and myself. I wrongly accused him of taking my wallet, but through his patience, kindness, and integrity, the truth came to light." The audience murmured in agreement and showed their support for Jamal. Mrs. Clark's voice was filled with emotion. "Jamal's actions reminded me of the importance of community and the potential each young person holds. To honor his character and support others like him, I have established the Jamal Washington Scholarship Fund." There were gasps and cheers from the crowd as Mrs. Clark explained. "This fund will provide financial assistance to Jamal and other deserving students in our community. It will help them pursue their educational dreams and build a brighter future." Jamal's eyes widened with disbelief. Mrs. Clark smiled at him. "Jamal, you've shown us all what it means to be a true leader. This is my way of saying thank you and ensuring that your kindness continues to inspire others." The room erupted in applause. Jamal stood up with tears in his eyes, the recognition and generosity overwhelming him. This would make his dreams of a better future come true and open doors he could only dream about. At that moment, it was simply too much to assimilate. The announcement of the Jamal Washington Scholarship Fund brought a wave of celebration throughout the community. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement. His neighbors, friends, and family gathered around Jamal to congratulate him and express their admiration for his resilience and character. His family felt a profound sense of relief and pride. Mrs. Washington hugged her son tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You've always made my heart proud, Jamal, but today you've shown everyone what I've always known. You have a heart of gold." Aisha and Malik looked up at their brother with eyes filled with awe. They hugged him and told him he was their hero. The celebration continued into the evening with laughter, stories, and a shared sense of unity. The community, once divided by misunderstanding, was now closer than ever, and it was all because of the power of kindness and the spirit of support. As the night drew to a close, Jamal stood with his family, looking out at the faces of friends and neighbors. Jamal knew that together they could overcome any challenge. The future was bright, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the power of doing good and standing by each other. The Scholarship Fund, a testament to his character and the strength of his community, was a beacon of hope and a promise of a better tomorrow. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your path of growth, take action and subscribe to the Vidas Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I would love to hear your opinion, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you believe this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.